The position 10 years ago was appropriate for that environment, given how much the environment has shifted in terms of just taking into account everyone's new perspectives on gender identity and how many people believe that transgenderism is this fundamental religion, like gender identity is literally like a soul to people. You can't just use that same navigational strategy that worked 10 years ago because the environment is qualitatively different.
But I think people are deluded, and I think there's all sorts of historical examples in which a populace gets deluded and demands certain things of a government and state actors that we ought not to indulge merely because that's what people claim they want. I'm still trying to figure out how we find the center. What does that mean? Because center is definitionally relative to a right and a left here.
Yes. Okay. Let me try and add this layer. Enlightened centrism is fundamentally aligned to the truth, is how I see it. Is like the truth is not in the center in terms of polling data. Galileo, it's like he was correct. Didn't matter what the rest of the populace believed. The enlightened centrist position would say, well, first off, commitment to the truth is that's bare basics.
Unless you're talking about the Platonic noble lie, which it could be argued certain world religions were influenced by that idea.
Well, sure, but then you get into the nuances of metaphorical truth and what does it mean.
But as far as like right now, would you say that there is some kind of a position that you would be much more progressive minded on as far as what's going on in the United States? Because like, let's have a very practical discussion here.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And I try to pick the ones that most everyone are familiar with, but like transgender issues. I think Matt Walsh is a political fool for trying to advocate that the government should consider making body modification for adults illegal, because that's what you would need to do to prevent an adult from getting transgender surgery. So I'm progressive on that, to the point where I would say, Matt Walsh, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. When Michael Knowles says
his argument is not just kids, it's adults as well. Just to be clear.
Correct. He specifically says it doesn't end with kids. It shouldn't be allowed on anyone, adults included. So that's an example of that is too far right. What do you think, Lomez?
On the specific question of transgenderism and adult body modification, I would certainly say that I have no idea what Matt Walsh has said on this subject. So
I'm just giving an example. We can forget,
but. No, I wouldn't want, for example, the policy question that has been brought up in regards to this is, for example, whether prisoners, who want to transition ought to have their surgeries covered by public health money.
Hell no is the answer to that.
Okay, good. We agree.
Right.
So I think
you're on your way to the Enlightened Center.
Well, I don't know that I am. I certainly don't think on the question of transgenderism, I would fall within the Enlightened Center, because I think from what I've heard on the progressive side of this question and what they call gender affirming care is a case of delusion. I don't think they're right at all. I don't think there is any merit whatsoever in the argument that a person's gender is constructed somehow on there's
the idea of gender identity like a soul.
Yeah, well, not just that, but that it overrides or is a more important sort of factor in determining these questions than someone's biological sex. We sort of have a scientific answer to this question. Like, when you get into the question of gender, there are somewhat interesting, although I think sort of purely academic questions about what we mean when we talk about identity and these sorts of things, which I'm frankly not that interested in. But the question of whether or not we should be making it a point of sort of cultural importance or public health policy to ensure and to expend a large amount of resources, except for in cases of severe mental health, where we're really talking about the very fringes of the population, or cases of the very rare cases of sort of intersex people. This question doesn't even belong, frankly, in the public discourse. And so for someone like Matt Walsh to say, listen, we should just table this completely, where we were at 10 years ago was perfectly adequate to deal with this situation is exactly what should obtain now, I think is a completely reasonable position to take.
Okay, well, that's where we would disagree, because I would say you're ignoring the reality of people's viewpoints now. So the environment correct, the position 10 years ago was appropriate for that environment, but given how much the environment has shifted in terms of just taking into account everyone's new perspectives on gender identity and how many people believe that transgenderism is this fundamental religion, like gender identity is literally like a soul to people. It no longer, you can't just use that same navigational strategy that worked 10 years ago, because the environment is qualitatively different.
But I think people are deluded, and I think there's all sorts of historical examples in which a populace gets deluded and demands certain things of a government and state actors that we ought not to indulge merely because that's what people claim they want.
Okay, so because you mentioned this twice now, the concept of delusion, and I think I might be able to ask you some questions that'll get us to where I think our disagreement is. There's the simple point of just one person's delusion is another person's religion. I mean, are you Christian?
No.
Okay, that'll be the next thing we immediately jump into. But certainly, it's not inconceivable for me to hear someone say, people who think that Jesus literally rose from the dead or that Jesus comes down and heals people, like, that's delusional. I'd go, yeah, I wouldn't use that term, but I understand that. And just the same, well, somebody thinks that, like, if you, put on a dress and call yourself this, that makes you a woman, that's delusional. I go, yeah, okay, I can see that. So I agree in principle, someone can be deluded, but then it's like, well, the question is, I believe you can act in such a way that accounts for a certain level of delusion. Obviously, once it gets to mass psychosis, the society is going off the rails, and then history plays out like it has. And if I'm doing anything, I'm trying to avoid that. And the power grid going down. That's my other pet project. I would sell my YouTube channel if I could make the power grid more reliable. But on the question of religion, okay, because I would say this is precisely in the crosshairs of where I think you're going to find issues. So you say you're on the right. You're not centrist. You're right wing.
Yeah, on balance. Yeah.
How do you prevent yourself from getting outflanked by people who are further right than you? Because there are people obviously further right than you who regard you as a progressive liberal.
I doubt they regard me as a progressive liberal. I highly doubt that. And if they did, it would be a category.
Fair enough, functionally progressive. That your refusal to commit to Christian fundamentalism, for example.
Well, they would maybe not accept me into a sort of theocratic sort of administration or something, and I would say they're well within their right to do that. I wouldn't.
Would you support a theocratic administration?
If I felt that within some kind of contextual environment, a theocratic administration would be. I mean, I treat politics as sort of strictly a pragmatic case
that's
of
fair.
What we can accomplish and get done. And there are some contexts in which, yes, a theocratic, politics makes sense or may make sense. And so I'm not opposed to it on principle. No, even if that meant excluding me personally from decision making, that's okay.
But that's the problem, because the right-wing ideologues are not looking at it pragmatically, and so they would excise you as someone who calls themselves on the right but is leading to progressive policies. Like for example, I'll take an extreme example to just illustrate the principle. There are Christian nationalists, and certainly the Christian nationalism memeplex. I like to think of things in terms of Dawkins' memetics idea. The Christian nationalist meme complex is on the rise, and in the next decade or two, I think will be defined by Christian nationalism on the right. The writing is on the wall. Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, all these people on the front end of the adoption curve are pushing Christian nationalism right, not left. There are Christian nationalists who believe that we should ban condoms and contraception because it's against God in their interpretation. Do you support that, or would you actively say that that's wrong?
I don't at present support banning condoms, but I will say the idea of like a Christian nationalist does not concern me. Many of these people are my friends, and I think that actually a Christian, look, different Christian nationalists have different ideas about what that means, and so to speak of this as like a single thing, I think is a mistake. But I think we are a Christian nation. I do believe that. I believe America is a Christian nation, and so the idea that there are people on the right who are Christian who want to assert the Christianness of Americanness and American governance is perfectly reasonable. And I think actually is a good thing. And given where we're at right now, we could use more of the sort of Christian and theological substrate that gave rise to our government in the first place. I think actually we're missing a lot of that, and I want some of it back. So
I 100% agree. It's very enlightened centrist of you to say that, because you want some of it back. Would you support, do you think, all else being equal in the current context or whatever context we find ourselves in, do you think it would be better if evolution was banned from being taught in schools or not?
Do I want evolution banned from schools?
If a Christian nationalist government took power and said, we're not teaching evolution in public schools anymore, wouldn't you agree that that's going too far right?
This gets in, so again, the practical question is, what are we trying to accomplish with a public school system? And we have to define what our goals are for public schools. I think most Christian nationalists would not want to abide by the sort of constraints that you would be under if you had like a robust public school system. They seem to me to want private schools. They want
I
parochial education that's highly regional and is contextual to their political or particular strain of belief. And so they want this kind of localism in education, which is what I sort of prefer. And if there are certain public schools where there is a large enough interest in, let's say, banning something like
evolution.
I was going to say evolution. Yeah, teaching of evolution. I wouldn't object to that on like sort of Christian grounds. Now, I will say where I maybe break from more hardline people on the right, and I made this joke before, when the right wins, what they'll put me up against the wall for is my defense of free speech. I think free speech is sort of fundamental to everything here. And so long as within this context in which you're banning evolution or pick your thing from public schools, there's a space carved out where you can teach whatever you want to teach. That's fine. Now, I will say I am also oriented towards truth. Okay. I want people to focus on what is true.
Like evolution, for example.
Well, yes. So let's focus on what we can demonstrate. And I think there are plenty of very smart Christians who have found very interesting and compelling ways to accommodate evolution into their beliefs. And I've talked to quite a few people who came from, fundamentalist backgrounds, or there are fundamentalist Christians who are also scientists who don't have this problem with sort of evolution and their Christian faith. And that's it's sort of archaic. Like these are arguments that, were made, 20 years ago or whatever. But I think a lot of this stuff has been solved, and it's been solved precisely because we've had this sort of robust dialogue about the conflicts between these, or the ostensible conflicts between these beliefs, and people have found a way to synthesize them.
One of my biggest intellectual influences would be pre-coma, pre-Daily Wire, Jordan Peterson, and I will make that distinction very clear. Pre-coma, pre-Daily Wire. And so the idea of like cultural Christianity and how even Western secular morality is fundamentally rooted in Christian ethics, I think that's indisputable. So we're aligned on that. I guess what I still don't understand is, because you said you're oriented towards truth fundamentally, right? That's truth is highest value.
Yeah, I mean, truth is, okay. For lack of we don't need to get more nuance than that. That'll be
fair enough. Yeah, there's pragmatic truth and all this different type of stuff. But yeah, sure, you and I agree, truth is the highest value. Okay, the right wing in its ideological extreme forms threatens truth just as much as the left wing.
Maybe not. I'm not willing to.
So? You don't. Okay, well,
no.
Okay, well, let me posit to you. You tell me why I'm wrong. So the left wing threatening of truth, I think, is at least people who are probably watching this video are more familiar with how the left, or at least see it more now in the terms of the postmodern bullshit going online and how truth is all subjective and gender identity is, a soul and all this different stuff. Okay. Clearly the far left can threaten and deny truth. In fact, they outright say that, like the postmodernist school. Fundamentalist Christianity, like I said, through denial of evolution, which is a more significant. I'd have to check the last polling, but it's a much larger it's not like this 5, 10, 15% of people. There's like 30 to 40%, I believe, somewhere around there, who does not believe in evolution, would be okay if evolution was not taught in schools. If evolution was not taught, then I think that undermines our very ability to get to truth, which is, you and I agree, is the highest order value. So I don't see how you can say truth is my highest value and not at the same time say, therefore, I will utterly reject right-wing ideological extremism when it manifests as being too extreme. And that is inherently, in my opinion, enlightened centrist.
I mean, you're making the assumption that the denial of evolution is some kind of categorically right-wing position, and I just don't think that it is.
Well, no, that's fair, because the left does it just as much with the sex denial, but certainly the right does it. If anything, that just proves my point more. They're both capable of denying evolution,
but not as a function of being on the right. So there are people on the right who deny evolution, but that's not.
It's not related to the creationist theology.
Well, no, I mean, look at like the part of the right that I come from. Certainly is not known for the denial of evolutionary or biological realities.
And I'll just show you my cards. I'm trying to exploit that difference right now. How do you differentiate?
Yeah. So what I'm driving at, though, is that I think you're making a category error. So you're trying to say that there is something inherent to rightness, and the further right out you get, you're entering into some territory in which truth becomes compromised. And there may be subsets of the outer right for which that's true, but it's not because they're on the right. It's because of their sort of constellations of particular beliefs that are distant from truth. But it may be the case that there is some piece of the landscape that is way out on the furthest stretches of the right, okay? However, we're going to define that. Like way, way out on the borderlands of the right, where you are going to uncover truth.
Sure, I agree with that. Yeah, totally. That's completely possible. The denial of evolution is not that place.
Well, unless you're talking about like
hold on, and just to clarify, the reason I'm sticking to this with this example is because I am in you operate in your spaces. The Christian nationalists who I interact with positively or negatively, this is a pretty central element to their belief, and I promise you they would say that you are, if you're not outwardly a liberal, you are just going to concede to liberal beliefs unless you submit to fundamentalist Christian doctrine. We're not fundamentalists, but whatever their particular interpretation is. And I agree, probably the biggest flaw in Christian nationalism is it's subject to the same kind of internal theological disputes that have characterized Christianity for the last 2,000 years, essentially. But the reason I stick on the evolution one is because the assumption I'm making is you believe evolution is true, I believe evolution is true, and we're using it broadly. There's nuances about the mechanisms behind evolution. But like what Tucker Carlson said on Joe Rogan, did you see what he said about evolution? Like, I think we've disproved evolution. We've abandoned evolution. Wouldn't you agree that that's to the degree that Tucker Carlson is saying that because of his right-wing Christian beliefs, that's going too far? Is that not a fair statement to make?
I actually don't know exactly what Tucker. I sort of caught wind of something he said on Joe Rogan, so I have some sense of what you're.
We can pull it up. We can get a live reaction now.
I mean, I'm willing.
Well,
look, here's the thing. I'm willing to concede that there are people on the right and the far right and the center right and every right in between, who are wrong and about any given question. Okay, about some category of questions, but their wrongness and their distance from the truth on that question, again, is not a function of them being on the right.
Okay, that's the second time you've said that, and just to I genuinely am trying to understand. I don't understand how you can say that the denial of evolution from Christian fundamentalists, let's say, is not a function of their creationist Christian theology, which
it's
is
a function of their religion. It's not a function of their political orientation.
I don't. Okay, well,
Well,
I
Paul,
guess
do you see a connection between religion and political orientation? Then?
I see those as almost synonymous. Politics is a religion in many ways.
Yeah, but we have Christians who are on the right and on the left. So how do you square that?
Well, yeah, and there's different. There's fundamentalist Christians, and then there's the
there's
Protestant.
even people in the same church, you know, who are listening to the same pastor, and one's a liberal.
Would it be fair to say? Would it be fair to say not on the right, but more, let's say, atavistic or more traditional-minded, like people that want to repeat certain patterns that their ancestors have been going through because they see it as a way to keep society, you know, functioning in this relatively stable way? Would that be like a good way, like that both you, Paul, and Lomez would agree that there are people who long for like repeating the same pattern so as to ensure stability, regardless if it points to the truth or not?
I have no problem with that description. And just to prove Lomez's point, there's Protestant female pastors who say Jesus was non-binary.
Yeah,
that's fair. And I would say, and again, you know, I get that people have issue with the terms left and right, and fair enough. There's plenty of issues with the left and right. And I do think there's a lot of truth that what was a right-wing issue previously gets switched. So skepticism of pharmaceutical companies was a classically left-wing position. It seems to have reversed. So I'm not saying that left and right are fixed, but the categories of left and right are fixed relative to each other. So the fact that there are progressive Christians, it's like, cool. I would say those are left-wing Christians. They're going too far left. They've flown off the text, the biblical text entirely. But then the mirror problem of that, which is a different problem, is the hyper-literalist perspective. To be hyper-literalist is I would say is right wing, because it's, you know, it's conserving what was said at the very beginning of whatever
but you can be hyper-literalist on gender ideology as well. Like there are certain sects, you know, within colleges.
I'm using literalist as in literalist interpretation of the Bible, because yes, you can be a constitutional literalist. I'm not talking about
you can be a Tumblr literalist. You know, you could be very literal about how they.
Yeah. I guess the broader point I'm making is because you Lomez, I think you say you're dissident, right? Is sort of that's your faction, or
no?
How do you?
I don't even like that term. I think dissident, again, it's like in reaction to something else. I think, look, because and I think part of maybe the disconnect here, and sorry to interrupt, but I think part of the disconnect here is how we are arriving at political orientation to begin with. And I think you're coming from the starting point that it's based on a set of ideas or something. I actually don't think that's right. I take actually something like what Jonathan Haidt says about sort of moral intuitions very seriously when it comes to political
Jonathan
orientation.
Haidt is,
and I think we're operating according to a set of almost gut preferences, biological preferences that are kind of baked into how we experience the world, and you know, our preferences, not just about the kind of sort of society we want to live in, but even more just sort of day to day, like the things we enjoy to do, the sort of where we want to live, and the sort of environments that we want to live in. And a lot of this stuff is just sort of hardwired in, and then we very crudely map on a set of sort of articulated policy positions on top of that. But there's this loss of clarity when you try to sort of go from one to the other. And I think, you know, when you're asking, like, are you dissident right? Okay, here's what I would say. I would say if my set of sort of biological intuitions, my moral intuitions, the things that I like, my preferences, for right now in the current year, map more closely when you extract that out into public policy, into political policy, onto what would be defined as like right wing, sort of solidly right wing positions. But,
agreed.
Yeah. Okay. So
That doesn't make you fundamentally right wing. In a different environment, you could be left wing.
Potentially, yeah. I suppose I could, yeah, depending on how we define those terms.
Welcome
but there
to-
would be some
Welcome to a team enlightened centrism, Lomez.
But no, but well, maybe. I mean, I'm still unclear though how we arrive
I'm
at the
being
center.
also a bit of a dick here. And also, just to be clear, no, I am. I'm being shippy with this. Just real quick to the point on moral intuitions, I 100% agree. Philosophical temperaments or moral foundations theory that's why part of the reason I say religion and politics are almost synonymous is because the same personality mechanisms that are guiding your perceptions for your religious beliefs and your political beliefs they're similar, and their personality, they're part of your personality. And the point about when you try to add rational articulation on top of that, it almost goes nowhere. One of my best videos of all time is called "Why Everyone Who Disagrees with Me Is Probably Autistic," and it's precisely that point of you can't put into logic all of these deep foundational issues, and a lot of how we base our opinions of people is through their behavior, through their body language, through their in the Petersonian sense, in the degree to which they imitate the hero archetype. The hero archetype being the most evolutionary stable strategy for producing maximal fitness. What behaviors has evolution selected for that produce maximal fitness in human beings? Your interest in mythology, I think, runs exactly along those lines, where like mythology encapsulates or models the kind of behavior that certainly the ancient mythology and prior to that, whatever, evolution selected for as being the most adaptive. So I'm 100% on board with that. And I forgot where I was going, but when I say welcome to Team Enlightened Centrism, I'm aware that that's, listen, you take dissident right, and I will take condescendingly refer to myself as enlightened, and we'll see how that works in the moment.
Yeah, I think. Well, one thing I just that came to mind as we're having this conversation about moral intuitions and moral foundations theory is the again, and this is for the sake of stress testing, enlightened centrism here.
Please,
I'm not trying to pick on this idea or anything, but. So then what you're asking for people to do in some sense is divorce themselves from their intuitions. If they're feeling these sort of strong pulls that are sub-rational towards some set of positions.
Like what do you like? What's an example of that?
Immigration or abortion or whatever it is. Like there's a certain xenophobia, okay, let's say, that is that I might be able to come up with all sorts of rationale for why, there's some utilitarian case to be made for restricting immigration, but maybe deep down I am just a xenophobe. Okay, I'm willing to sort of concede that.
Sure,
maybe that's right. Okay.
Well, we all have in-group preference, and anyone who denies that is lying.
Yeah, but maybe mine are really strong, and the reason I'm so hard line against immigration, which I am, is because I have this like deep-seated revulsion toward the other, okay, this sort of xenophobic tendency. And what you're asking me to do with your enlightened centrism is to divorce myself from that intuition and adopt a policy preference that runs counter to the thing, this deep sort of gut feeling that's making me arrive at this strict sort of immigration stance. Now, I will say, okay, maybe there's some like wisdom in that. Maybe that moderating impulse is good, but I need to know why I'm wrong. Why are I like my?
There's something I want to bring in here, which I think is incredibly relevant from the writer Devin Erickson, who is actually going to be on BTR in a couple of weeks with Oren McIntyre, a friend of the show. You know him, Lomez, right? Oren McIntyre.
Of course, I know Oren. Yeah, very well.
Yeah.
Great guy.
So Oren had a great thread over here. I'm just going to read a little part of this because I think this kind of goes right into what I anticipate is like the biggest problem going forward here. So when societies become highly permissible, the productive weirdos, the ones who simply can't fit in because they are creative and useful ways, become surrounded by, outnumbered by, a horde of cargo cult imitators. These people imagine themselves to be creative free spirits because they compete to be as freaky as possible. They do not understand that freaky behavior is not creative talent. It is only a side effect of creative talent. Often these people are defective and useless, which is why they seek to use freakiness to camouflage themselves as creative, hoping to hide their uselessness. This progresses until normies get disgusted with them and start thinking fascism might be a good idea. Then they kill everyone. This wipes out all the depraved freaks from number one, but it also wipes out Oscar Wilde, Alan Turing, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, Pablo Picasso, etc. Because normie dullards can't tell the difference, especially when their blood is up. So which is kind of like what we were talking about with that gut feeling that you were bringing up, Lomez. And then he writes, I understand why a lot of the right is educating itself about Weimar Germany and re-examining fascism as a response to those conditions. The impulse makes sense. Disgust is an entirely appropriate emotional response right now. But they don't understand that even if it has rational origins, fascism, like communism, is a process that spirals out of control. Fascism isn't just an expression of disgust. It is an ever-increasing hypersensitivity to disgust, created by a social and cultural echo chamber. Once it eliminates the original objects of disgust, it moves on to find more mildly disgusting things to target. Eventually, any deviation from the norm, however trivial and harmless, becomes an object of disgust to be eradicated. Your thoughts? Either one, Paul, Lomez.
That I would say perfectly encapsulates the risk that I'm worried about.
Okay, and that, I think you're perfectly within reason to worry about it if the goal is sort of ongoing stability and we want to reduce the possibility of carnage, which I think we all do. But I also think you have to then reconcile with the fact that this disgust impulse, and we'll just use that as a sort of a catch-all for all of these sort of gut level intuitions that are pushing people away from a sort of centrist, stable view of liberal democracy, that these disgust impulses may very well be a kind of necessary instinct and reaction to a liberal democracy or a centrism that, in Oren's words, have become too permissible. That
Agreed.
There needs to be some like sort of clearing of the forest. I don't
Amen.
mean that violently, okay?
Sure.
But that the disgust impulse is itself a very healthy and good thing. And those of us who feel it strongly ought not to suppress it. It's very important, in fact, when people feel this and when it reaches a sort of critical mass, that we at least take seriously what's giving rise to it and may try to find anyway, productive ways of exercising that disgust impulse, or, at least sublimating it. I'm just wary of denying that this disgust impulse exists or that it's bad, that I shouldn't have it.